This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Let me read an excerpt. Educators across the country are intimately familiar with the struggles of children experiencing adversity, as are social workers, mentors, pediatricians, and parents. If you work with kids who are growing up in poverty or other adverse circumstances, you know they can be difficult to reach, hard to motivate, hard to calm down, and hard to connect with. Those of us who seek to overcome these educational disparities face many obstacles, some financial, some political, and some bureaucratic. But the first obstacle, I would argue, is conceptual. We don't yet entirely understand the mechanisms behind childhood adversity. What is it about growing up in poverty that leads to so many troubling outcomes? Or, to put the question another way, what is it that growing up in affluence provides to children that growing up in poverty does not? That is on the rear jacket of a book that I'm holding in my hands, titled Helping Children Succeed, What Works and Why, by Paul Tough. Paul's prior work, How Children Succeed, was a New York Times bestseller. This is a really interesting book. It's data-driven, but it's right at the cross-section of all conflict, from my perspective, all conflict that we see in America. Now, all is a big word, but when you start to look at young kids, how they are growing, how they are developing, and realize that even though we can turn on the TV and we can see all the conflict, we can see the adversity, we can see sometimes the pure chaos currently in America. If we backtrack a little, go back in time and examine what happens at those early stages, there's a lot to be learned. My guest today is Paul Tough, and he is the author of Helping Children Succeed. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Paul, I don't know exactly where we're going to go in this conversation today, but I want to tell the audience from the outset, as a guy who has a political science major in his distant past, who once ran for political office, your work, the work that I'm looking at right now that I've read, Helping Children Succeed, everyone should read this. This is a book that everyone should read, regardless of what they might think about the title or what they might think is inside. This is information that everyone needs to understand. And I want to tear that apart with you today and then talk about some of the ramifications. I'm sure you like hearing someone say that.
That's great to hear. You'll broadcast that far and wide. That's great. Looking forward to discussing it.
So let's just jump into the really tough statistic that you lead with, which is, my understanding is that right now, 51% of school kids in the U.S. that are going to public schools, 51% are below the threshold for low income. That's a majority the last I checked, right?
Yes, that's right. And that number's been going up over the past few decades. In the 80s, it was about a third of all public school students who were eligible for a free or reduced price lunch, which is the federal government's measure of who is low income and who is not. But it was just in 2013 that for the first time that the number passed 50%. And to me, I think that, in some ways that 50% marker is a little bit arbitrary, but to me it's an important symbol, at least, for the fact that the issues that low-income kids have in public school and school today, and education in the United States as a whole, I think in the past we've seen that as sort of a side issue in education. We feel like there are these central kind of educational issues, and then there are problems of poor kids off to the side. And what I think this new number tells us is that we can't think about it that way anymore. We need to think about the challenges that many low-income kids have in education as really the central problem of the central question of American education. And it's no longer just the responsibility of a few people to solve. It's really a national responsibility to take this on.
But what's really interesting is That statement, what you just said, you really don't say till the end of the book. You kind of lead the audience down a path of like, here's what's happening from birth to the end of high school, psychological level, cognitive level, any kind of neuro measurements, genetic level. I mean, you kind of go through this every step of the way as to what happens when you have a child that is in a low-income family, because the low income is just a marker for probably many other things going on in that family.
You're right. I think that, there are lots of kids who are below that threshold who are actually living very, happy, stable, successful lives. And there are lots of kids who are growing up in well-off homes who have all kinds of adversity and stress and are really struggling. But I think it's a pretty useful marker for the kids who are going to need have extra challenges and are going to need extra support. And you're right, I do spend a lot of time in this book talking about science, talking about, brain development and psychology and what happens in child development when kids are growing up in environments of real adversity. And the reason that I focus so much on that science is that I think that it gives those of us who aren't living in adverse circumstances a new kind of understanding of what's going on in the lives of kids in poverty. I think we all have known for a while that kids who grow up in poverty are not doing as well in school as kids who are not growing up in poverty. We haven't, I think, as a nation, had a real understanding of the science behind why that is. And so I think as a result, it's a problem that we tend to try to compartmentalize, to say, like, this is just an issue of culture. It's an issue of sort of systemic structural problems in the economy that can't be fixed unless we, change the entire economy. But actually, when you look at the science, it's all very much more kind of understandable and predictable. Like, growing up in certain environments affects kids in very measurable, understandable ways, and that affects how they do in school. And we can do things to change those environments, to improve things for those kids. And so the solution does not have to mean sort of a vast remaking of the country. It's a big deal, I think, solving this problem. But at least I think the science makes it feel much more manageable and understandable.
I think if we all look at the headlines, whether at CNN or Fox News or whatnot in the last 6 months, it's been a pretty volatile situation on the streets of America, a lot of discord. And we look at the adults and we see the young people. But what I really find interesting about your work is that if we take it back to the very early stages, before we even get to kindergarten, the way that a child is coming along, there's much predictive value to see what's going on in those first couple years of life, to almost see and imagine what's going to happen in their teen years, 20s and 30s.
I think that's true. I mean, I think we have to be cautious when we're looking at that science, because I think there's a risk that it can make us, overly fatalistic and say, like, oh, well, if kids have a bad first couple of years, they're doomed. And I think it's important, and I write a lot in the book about interventions in, elementary school and middle school and high school that I think can really turn things around for kids who have difficult beginnings. But that said, the science, I think, is you're right, very clear that the first few years of life, first 1, 2, 3 years of life, are the time where so many of the problems have their root, and it's also the place that is most efficient and most effective for us to intervene. When we can help stabilize families with kids in those early years, we can have a tremendous effect on tremendous positive effect on the outcomes that those kids are going to have as they become older children and adolescents and even adults. Let's
give people something tangible. You talk about the give and take between parents and a small child, let's say just even 6 months, a year, 2 years. Just so people don't think we're only having a conversation that affects perhaps low-income brackets, you make the point in some of your writings as well, the lessons that you've seen with your own children in how some of these early positive steps can take place. Why don't you talk about that give and take and that attention, how important that attention is to a very young child?
Sure. So I have a 1.5-year-old right now, and so during the time that I've been working on helping children succeed, he was born and had his first few months, and so I really, as I was reading the science about early brain development, and early character development, I was thinking constantly about him and trying to actually implement some of the ideas that were in this research with him. And so there are two main things I think that are important for any parent to think about, or any of us to think about in terms of what's happening in that early development. One is stress. When kids are growing up in environments with what doctors sometimes call toxic stress. So not just occasional stressful moments that scare kids and then they're able to get calmed down, but kind of constant and chronic and intense stress. That has this enormous effect on how children develop, on especially on the development of our stress response system and sort of our fight or flight network. And when kids are growing up in situations where there is a lot of stress, a lot of instability, a lot of chaos, they adapt. The stress response system is in some ways like an adversity thermostat. It takes the measure early on in life of what life is going to be like, and when the signals suggest that life is going to be hard, it adapts by preparing for trouble. So kids in those circumstances develop this stress response system that's kind of on a hair trigger. This highly active fight or flight response. It has physical effects. It fires up their immune system. It increases their blood pressure and their heart rate. It puts more cortisol and adrenaline into their bloodstream. And all of those things make sense in the short term when you're in a dangerous situation, but they are not very effective when you get to kindergarten or even pre-K. They make it harder to sit still, to focus, to learn things calmly, to get along with peers, to accept, criticism or direction from teachers. Those kids are much more likely to kind of react sharply and in a stressed out way to that kind of input from their environment. The other thing I think that is happening in those early years is about attachment and connection between parents or caregivers and infants. There's this method of parenting or method that parents use called serve and return parenting. This wasn't something that I'd encountered before working on this book, but it's a phrase that some researchers at Harvard have used for the kind of basic interactions between parents and children, where an infant will make some sort of vocalization or a sound, or even look at a toy or at a family pet or something like that, and the parent responds by just saying, "Oh, those are your toes," or "You're waving hello," or "I love you too," or something like that. And that kind of back and forth has a very important influence on how children develop. Not only cognitively, it helps kids learn language and make connections between I make an action and someone else responds, but it also helps kids psychologically, emotionally. It gives them a sense of who they are, how they fit into the world around them. And when kids don't get that kind of calm, careful, face-to-face, day-by-day interaction with parents, and a lot of kids who are growing up in particularly stressful and chaotic homes do not get that, it has, again, a really negative effect on their development.
Many people in my audience appreciate data. And for those that do appreciate data, they're going to find out that your work is grounded in the data. I mean, there's the things that we're having this conversation about. This is not just Paul giving opinions. You've gone and done the heavy lifting. You break childhood down into these discrete chapters and thinking about each discrete chapter. And then it's a continuum of, from birth to the end of high school, and looking at each step along the way. And, for some kids that come from an affluent home that, the parents are highly educated and it's not as much an issue. But for those that are not in that situation, it's a big deal. And I think breaking the childhood into these discrete blocks that we can look at really makes a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense to me.
I mean, I sort of have two different approaches that I talk about in the book. I mean, one is that, yes, it makes sense to look at these as different chapters, and early childhood is clearly different than what's going on in adolescence. But I do think that it's also important to look at it as a continuum. And one of the flaws, I think, in our public policy and just sort of the way that we, as a nation, address children's development is that we do tend to segment it too much, literally in terms of how the federal government influences children. The first 5 years of life, you're under the domain of the Department of Health and Human Services, which does early childhood programs and Head Start and things like that. And then on the first day of kindergarten, your file is sort of magically transferred over to the Department of Education. And that division might make sense from a bureaucratic point of view, and it is echoed in divisions on the state level and on the county level and on local levels, but it actually doesn't make sense in terms of how children develop. And for kids and families, that really is a continuum. I mean, the first day of kindergarten is a big deal, but what happens on that first day is affected by everything that's happened before. And we tend, I think, both bureaucratically and individually, to think of these as two very separate realms. And the more that we can think of it as a continuum, I think the more likely we're going to be able to develop policies and practices that help kids develop throughout that trajectory.
If there's neurocognitive dysfunction before the first day of kindergarten, then you will have academic dysfunction starting on the first day of kindergarten, period.
Yes, I would say that. I mean, I would maybe make it a comma instead of a period to say that, yes, that's very likely. But I think it's also important to recognize that schools then play a big role in how they react to those kids. And schools can do a really good job of on kindergarten taking in kids who have not had the ideal upbringings and have encountered a lot of toxic stress and have not had enough, sort of attachment and serve and return parenting, and think, okay, what are we going to do with kids who are stressed out, who have this highly active fight or flight response? And there are lots of methods that can help those kids at 5 and at 6 feel that kind of connection and groundedness and stability that they haven't received in those first few years. And when schools do that, it has an enormous positive effect on how those children develop. The problem is most schools don't do that. Most schools aren't equipped to do that kind of, often very difficult and complicated teaching and development in the early years of elementary school. And in fact, on the contrary, the main tools that we have for dealing with those kids are discipline and punishment regimes. Because those kids, through the eyes of a kindergarten or first grade teacher, they look like cases of bad behavior. These kids do have trouble sitting still. They are more likely to get into confrontations with their peers. They don't follow directions sometimes as effectively as other kids. And if you're a kindergarten teacher, that just means that's a problem child, And our main tool that we have given to elementary teachers to deal with those kids is to punish them. And those punishments mostly don't work very well, because what those kids need is not actually, sort of negative and positive reinforcement. They need help and stability and connection and all the things that they haven't received in their earliest years.
So when I said period, I guess I'm thinking in terms of a bell curve. So I do not want to take away from the outliers and the people that, but overall, if I read your work, there is a middle of the bell curve that we can look at that is clearly troubling in terms overall. Yeah. So
and in disputing your period, it's not that I'm saying that the data is not clear. You're right. Absolutely. The data is clear that if kids grow up in that sort of circumstance, most of them are going to be really negatively affected by it. It's simply that I don't want age 5 to be the end of anyone's story. And so what I'm trying to imply by that comma is just that there's still a whole lot that we can do, that schools can do, to improve those kids' outcomes.
That's what I really liked reading this book, is because it lays out what you can do. I think if we all can imagine the last 30 years, though, that clearly a lot of what's been done in terms of has not really worked very well. So, and as you say in your work, you say you're not really sure that that these gaps can be eliminated or even closed.
I mean, I am optimistic that things can change. I think we do have a lot more knowledge and many more tools than we did 10 or 20 years ago. The science is much clearer. I think there are more innovative and interesting methods out there for teachers to use. But I do think that a lot of what we have done in terms of educational policy and educational innovations over the last 15 or 20 years, some of it has been great, but some of the major trends, I think, in education policy toward, accountability based on the results of standardized tests, that's sort of been the main federal policy over the last 2 presidential administrations, has had a lot of negative unintended consequences. It has created environments for a lot of kids that are more stressful, more focused not on sort of the psychological and emotional development of children, but just on their cognitive development, just on their scores on these tests that measure a very narrow range of skills. And that has put in additional stress on schools. It has put additional stress on teachers, and it's put additional stress on a lot of students as well.
Let's get into one of my favorite words, which you use quite liberally, and that is grit. I don't really care whether it's the lower income or the higher income. I think grit is something that across America we all probably need to get reattached with. But especially for the kids that are coming from the lower income environments, teaching grit and teaching curiosity, this isn't like teaching geometry or algebra or just basic math. These types of character development traits that we want kids to have, it's tricky to get these across, isn't it?
It really is. And so in my previous book, How Children Succeed, which came out in 2012, I wrote a lot about grit and the work of the psychologist Angela Duckworth, who kind of invented the modern study of grit and has a new best-selling book out right now called Grit. And she was working at the time with various educators who were trying to figure out, so we know that grit, that perseverance is important for children, for any of us. When someone is able to stick with a goal for a long period of time to overcome obstacles, that is an incredibly important character strength. And they were trying to figure out, so how do we teach this? Like, what kind of lessons or pedagogies or curricula or textbooks can we come up with that can help kids become more gritty? And in this new book, in Helping Children Succeed, my conclusion is that mostly these skills are not things that we can teach like we would teach math or history or science. That instead they are the product of children's environments. And so if we want to help kids have more perseverance in the classroom, the way to do that is to influence their environment. So that includes, as we've talked about, their environment in the first few years of life. And I think we need to figure out ways to intervene more intensively and assertively in those first few years. But it also means thinking about the environment that kids have in their classrooms and beyond that in their schools and in their communities. The sort of psychological effect of the environment of a classroom is something that I don't think that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. Certainly it's not reflected in most of the policies that govern the way that our schools work. But those environments, research is now demonstrating, are tremendously important. And when kids are in a classroom environment that makes them feel connected, gives them a sense of independence, gives them a sense that they can improve and grow and accomplish new and difficult things, that has this remarkable psychological effect on them and makes them more motivated, and that makes them much more likely to persevere in the classroom. So there's a debate right now in education, I think, about whether that means that they actually have more grit or whether it means that they're just acting like they have more grit. But what I'm trying to say in this book is that doesn't matter. The question of whether grit is some sort of eternal substance that you either have or you don't have, I don't think it's a useful debate. What's more useful is to say, what behaviors do we want kids to have in school, and what can we do to help create environments that make it more likely that they're going to display those behaviors?
You bring up the classroom, and you have data to support this too, and I would love for you to get technical for a moment and perhaps explain the data and the data set and the conclusions you drew from it. And I believe it was a data set from North Carolina, but as we talk about the classroom, we should not be sitting back and thinking that all teachers are created equal, are they?
No, that's absolutely true. So this is a great study done by an economist who was looking at North Carolina, a guy named Carabo Jackson. What he chose to do was to take this giant database of ninth grade students in North Carolina, and he looked at, he was trying to investigate this basic tenet of the accountability movement, that we can look at students' test scores and use those to determine which teachers are doing a good job at helping their students succeed, and then find ways to reward those teachers or get rid of teachers who aren't doing as good a job at improving test scores. And when he decided to look at these numbers, not just in terms of how teachers affected students' test scores, which is the normal way that we look at accountability, but also how they affected students' non-cognitive skills, or character strengths, their grit and their perseverance and their self-control. And that's a really hard thing for any economist to do. So he also wanted to figure out how teachers were affecting students' non-cognitive skills or character strengths, things like grit and perseverance and self-control, which is something that's very difficult for an economist to do. It's something that's very difficult for an economist to do because we don't actually have good measures of grit and perseverance and self-control. We don't have tests that we can give kids to find out how good they are at those things. And so what he did was looked for existing bureaucratic data, and he found some really good indicators of perseverance. And what he discovered was that there were indeed certain teachers who did a good job of improving their students' scores on standardized tests of cognitive skill. But there were also certain teachers who did a particularly good job of developing their students in this non-cognitive realm. So if you were assigned to the classroom of one of these teachers who was particularly good in the non-cognitive realm, you were somehow more likely to show up in school. You were more likely to behave well. You were less likely to get in trouble. You were more likely to work hard in your classes. That idea, whether or not we know specifically whether those teachers were improving their students, grit or perseverance or self-control or what, those are the kind of behaviors that lead to success and don't get measured on standardized tests. And so what those teachers, those non-cognitive genius teachers were doing was something that is very important and something that is not really recognized in our current accountability system. And it suggests that there are things that teachers can do to make their students feel differently about school, to make their students just more motivated to show up in the morning, to work hard, and to persevere at difficult tasks. And so a lot of what I try to get at in the book is trying to figure out who those teachers are and what we can do to create more of them.
I look at how you talk about motivation, what motivates us. And we all want a sense of competence, a sense of autonomy. We want to connect with others. As I read your work, though, and I think about, okay, here you're coming at this perspective, getting me to think about perhaps lower income families and the issues they're dealing with. But then I start to think about the higher income families, and I say to myself, based on my personal experience with so many people that I grew up around who really didn't have income issues, and they just went through life saying, if I just got the rote memorization down, if I just got the grades, if I just did all that, and I went to the 4-year college, perhaps got the grad degree, and then when I wake up, it's all going to be dreamy. And it's almost like, for different reasons, both camps aren't getting the grit. Because I know plenty of kids that had all of the advantages that the kids that you're talking about in your work, they didn't have those same issues, but they don't have the grit. They just took perhaps the easy job that was there because they came from a certain socioeconomic strata and it was easy enough to move into. I don't know, maybe they wake up when they're 40 or 50 and they go, what am I doing? And they just have kind of gone along for the ride. And I wonder if I'm looking at the lower income side, I have to also look at the higher income side.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So this most recent book, Helping Children Succeed, is very much focused on low income kids and their particular challenges. My previous book, How Children Succeed, focused on those low-income kids, but also on high-income kids. I spent time reporting in a couple of independent schools, including one of the most exclusive schools in New York City. And as a result, I spent a lot of time, both before and after the book came out, talking to parents and teachers who are working with those and raising those higher-income kids. And you're absolutely right. I think there is this real concern and justified concern among a lot of those parents that their kids are really struggling in this character realm and are struggling with grit and with perseverance. And I think there is something in the way that we are organizing our independent schools and trying to influence the lives of well-off kids that is really detrimental to them developing these deep character strengths. And I think it does come down to that motivation, that we don't have. We're not giving kids this chance to learn through adversity, to push themselves, to try difficult things, to sort of risk things, and to struggle a little bit with academic and non-academic challenges. And when we give kids that opportunity, whether they're rich or poor, they are more likely to succeed and more likely to develop the kind of deep character capabilities that are going to let them take on new challenges in the future. So I think you're right that it's an issue for both. I think that the complication is that if you are from a well-off family, you can kind of get by without a lot of these character strengths. You're right. I think you do often wake up at 40 or 50 and say, I haven't really accomplished what I wanted to accomplish, or haven't even figured out what I want to accomplish. But you're actually doing pretty well, and you have enough to eat, and you have a decent job, and society has kind of created a path for you. The problem for kids who are growing up in low-income homes is if they don't have that kind of character direction early on, the results for them, the outcomes for them, can be much more dire.
Do you mind sharing something about yourself? How did you go down this path, this investigative path? Because I have to, I mean, you couldn't have just been a guy at 16 that wasn't asking questions. You must have been a skeptic.
Sure, yeah. So my own educational path was that in high school, I was going to a really pretty demanding academic school that was very focused not on character strength and non-cognitive skills, but on standardized test scores. And I think, like a lot of kids in that situation, I got pretty burned out on school as a result. So I had a really choppy college career. I got into Columbia University and went there for a semester and then dropped out. And sort of took on, I think I needed to give myself a challenge to overcome. So I decided to bicycle from Atlanta to Halifax and camp along the way. That was the kind of odyssey that I assigned myself. And it was this, this really important experience for me as a young person. It gave me this new sort of understanding of who I was and what I wanted to do. But my skepticism about higher education continued, and I ended up dropping out of college for a second time and going right into journalism. And I think that experience is obviously something that is different than a lot of the young people that I'm writing about now. But I think that it was the beginning of me kind of asking questions about what education is for and what kind of skills and qualities education should be trying to develop in kids, what kind of qualities kids need to succeed. And so in some ways, in my work and my reporting, I think I'm continuing to ask those same questions that I was asking back in high school and college when I was trying to figure out for myself who I wanted to be and what skills I was going to need to get there.
Yeah, I relate to that very choppy college career myself. The only reason I went to grad school is to make my undergrad grades look good. There was no reason to do it. And I look back on all of my experiences, and as kind of a self-starting entrepreneurial type who really hasn't worked for anybody since, I don't know, the age of 19. I'm in my late 40s. But I can think back that I just always detested the rote memorization as a method of teaching, because I felt like I was in the midst of, I guess I'm saying this in a negative way, I always felt like I was in the midst of sheep. And I felt like, how are all these people going to learn about anything? And I mean, look, I was too young to have the context to use grit as you're using it. But, as I get older, I'm like, that's what it was all about. And nobody, even in my educational path, that did not have the down periods like some of the families and kids that you're talking about and helping children to succeed. I still just kind of knew deep in my gut that this rote memorization, the way we go about school, is just all wrong.
I think for kids like you who had a more sort of entrepreneurial instinct, I think those kids are more likely to rebel against that kind of education. But even for the kids who seem to be going along with the program, who seem more like sheep, as you put it, I don't think that system is working for them either. I think that we have some basic strategies that we use in American pedagogy that don't work for any kids. And actually, most kids learn better when they have some challenge, where they have some sense of struggle, where they're actually learning facts and skills in the context of something bigger in terms of life, when the subjects they're learning are made more meaningful for them. And there's a way to do that kind of teaching. I think it's harder and more challenging than the kind of teaching that happens in most of our classrooms right now. And when it does happen, I think an additional problem is that well-off kids in private schools are more likely to get that kind of deep teaching than low-income kids in public schools. But I think that it is really a national problem. It's a challenge that we need to think about in terms of how we teach, whether we're talking about well-off kids or poor kids.
And as I said from the very beginning, this is one of these books where you just have to sit down. It's a quick read, but the detail and data behind it and getting people to think about that continuum from birth to the end of high school, that really puts into context many of the adult problems that we see in America. And I want to kind of, as I wind down here, I want to bring up the big picture issue that you really in the book with, which is, and I think could very easily be interpreted as controversial, which is that we can do better. On the face of it, I think that we all can do better. Be curious for your view on this. But if a critic is sitting back, though, and saying, hey, we can do better, and we can look at the last 30 years, and there's been, as you say, some ups and some downs, but overall, we've not had great progress. It does put, especially someone who has a little bit of a libertarian bent in me, it does put a little bit of strain on my thinking when I say, my gosh, I've got to trust more of the government to get it right. Because, I mean, look, it's literally impossible when I read this book of yours, it's literally impossible to go through it and say, oh, I disagree with that, I disagree with that, I disagree with that. You can't do it. The data's the data. I mean, it's factual. The key is that what do you do once we know this is true? What do you do?
Yeah, so that is what I try to answer at the end of the book, and I don't think that there's a super clear answer. I don't think there's just one solution that will answer all of our problems. But I do think that we need to, whether it's through the government or through independent nonprofits and agencies, we do need to take more responsibility as a society for the development of our children, and especially kids who are growing up in difficult circumstances. That the idea that it's just up to parents to get kids through, there's like a certain political logic to that, but it doesn't work for kids, because we don't get to, we get to make certain choices in life, but we don't get to choose our parents, we don't get to choose our zip code, we don't get to choose, the community into which we're born. And when you're born into a low-income community, into a family that has struggles, where parents are stressed out, where parents can't give kids the kind of help and support that they need to develop, those children need additional support, and that has to come from us. I do in the book talk about specific strategies, specific policies that I change and could make things better, but kind of where I come out in that final chapter is that the most important thing that has to change is just the way that we as a society think about our children's development, and we need to take more responsibility as a society. Again, whatever means we use to develop it or to deliver that help, whether that's through government or otherwise, as a society, we need to take a deeper responsibility for the successful development of all of our children, and especially the children who are growing up in the most difficult circumstances.
There's no doubt that's true, especially when you think ahead 10, 20, 30 years. If you don't take the action, the end result is pretty predictive.
Sure, and I think I think one of the things that that makes me optimistic about this field is that I think there are some people who relate to that message just from emotional, sort of touchy-feely, like it's good to help kids point of view, which I think is an important one. But there are also you can come to the same conclusions by being a hard-nosed capitalist and saying we need to improve the human capital in this country and think about it in a different way than we have been thinking about it. And so from that point of view, we've got a real crisis brewing. And the solution is the same one, that the place to start is in childhood, and especially in early childhood.
Paul, there's a lot of depth to your work. I implore people to read this, Helping Children Succeed. Available on Amazon now, available everywhere?
Yes, that's right. And I also have a website at paultough.com where you can find out more about the book and find links to various sources and videos to watch and things like that.
Paul, great stuff. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the conversation.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.